Guess what day it is?
Oh,
It's French Friday, it's French Friday, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Friday. It's French Friday.
David French, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me back. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I know you're melting down there in Tennessee, but glad that you,
Gosh.
it looks like you're in your air-conditioned office.
Yeah, and the air conditioning is struggling. Like it's so hot that my air conditioning is sometimes keeps my office below 85.
Oh.
So yeah, it's bad.
And as a fellow bald American, I understand how challenging that can be when the sweat just flows unimpeded down your scalp. Okay, so I want to talk about an article you wrote a couple weeks ago about the God gap. Now, the God gap is a term that's been around for a long, long time in political circles and describes the fact that in survey after survey, when polled, people who have strong religious belief tend to gravitate towards one political party, and people with less significantly held religious beliefs or more secular beliefs gravitate toward the other political party. Now, this holds true generally for white Americans.
Yes.
It's not as true for people of color, especially African Americans. But there's been some new data that shows there's some interesting changes that are happening with the God gap in the American political landscape. So let's begin by just give us the lay of the land. What's changing that's getting people's attention?
Yeah. So what's changing that's getting people's attention is the God gap within the Democratic Party. Because I think this is the thing that's really salient and very interesting. And that is that if you're looking at non-white Democrats and white Democrats, non-white Democrats have almost identical religious beliefs as like your median Republican. So a white Republican will say, and this is Pew data, that 72% believe in God as described in the Bible. Non-white Democrats, 61% of those individuals believe in God as described in the Bible. And if you go down and you get more specific, such as you describe God as all-powerful, all-knowing, and loving, well, non-white Democrats are statistically indistinguishable from white Republicans and also from non-white Republicans. So non-white Democrats and Republicans, including both white and non-white, have very similar basic background religious beliefs. Who's the outlier? The outlier are white Democrats. So only 32% of white Democrats believe in the God of the Bible. When you talk about those three characteristics, powerful, knowing, loving, it's 71% say that for white Republicans, 72% for non-white Republicans, 72% for non-white Democrat, and 38% for white Democrat. And
there's the gap.
That's the gap. And so the point that I was making is we don't need to focus quite as much on the Republican versus Democratic gap, but instead focus on the Democratic versus Democratic gap. And that's beginning to explain a lot of the shifts that we see in American politics.
So, okay, this comes to the forefront, though, because the data coming out of the 2020 election was kind of surprising and frankly upsetting to some people, because Donald Trump in 2020 won more Latino and African-American voters than he had in 2016. And those are the groups that also tend to be more religious, more conservative, have a more positive view of America in general than white secular Democratic voters. In your piece, you quoted a law professor from Yale, Stephen Carter, who 4 years ago, I want to read this. It's a couple sentences long, but it's so good.
Yeah.
This is what he said 4 years ago. Overall, people of color are more likely than whites to be Christians, and pretty devout Christians at that. Some 83% of all Black Americans are absolutely certain that God exists. No other group comes close to this figure. Black Christians are far more likely than white Christians, 84% to 64%, to describe religion as very important in their lives. Of all ethnic groups, Black Christians are the most likely to attend services, pray frequently, and read the Bible regularly. They are also, here's the kicker, most likely to believe that their faith is the place to look for answers to questions about right and wrong. And they are, by large margins, the most likely to believe that the Bible is the literally inerrant word of God. In short, if you find Christian traditionalism creepy, it's Black people you're talking about. So, in other words, there's a large segment of the more progressive, white, secular Democratic base that are doing things and using rhetoric that's alienating their own voters who are people of color.
Yes.
Okay, now here's my question. Are those voters who are people of color and deeply religious, be they Latino, Asian, African American, is it realistic to think they're actually going to go to the Republican Party as it currently exists?
Well, I think it's realistic to say that they're going there because they are. So if you look at 2012, from 2012 to 2016, even though Mitt Romney got a higher percentage of the overall vote than Donald Trump did in 2012, Donald Trump got a higher percentage of Black and Hispanic voters than Mitt Romney did. Okay, well, you can write that off and you can say, well, Hillary Clinton is just a much worse candidate than Barack Obama. Barack Obama, first Black candidate, first Black president, huge amount of, it really had developed this huge multiracial coalition. Hillary Clinton, one of the least liked presidential contenders of modern times. Of course, she's not going to do as well as Barack Obama. So you can write off 2016. Well, then here comes 2020. And 2020, Joe Biden didn't have anything like the negatives that Hillary Clinton did. And he won by he won a decisive popular vote victory. He won a decisive electoral college vote victory. He did far better than Hillary did. And yet Trump did even better in 2020 with Black and Hispanic voters than he did in 2016. We think, how is that possible? How could Joe Biden win? Well, because Joe Biden did a lot better with white voters than Hillary did. And so then the latest polling is indicating Hispanics are now to the point where they're almost 50-50 in between the Democratic and Republican parties. And Sky, I don't think that this means that necessarily that non-white voters are becoming loyal Republicans. It's much more that if you have a two-party system and one party becomes unpalatable to you for any given number of reasons, you're naturally at least going to dip your toe in the water of the other party, because that's the only place to go, barring the creation of some sort of viable third-party alternative. So it's not so much that the Republicans are just so welcoming to minorities that they are becoming a true multi-ethnic party. It's that in a lot of ways, the Democratic Party is becoming very culturally divided. And so a lot of voters who would normally be a part of the Democratic coalition don't feel as at home in that party as they did 4 years ago, as they did 8 years ago. And that's making a big difference in the two parties' alignments.
So there's been a lot written, and I think I've heard you talk about this on some of the Dispatch podcasts as well. There's been a lot written about young white secular progressives in the Democratic Party as being, I hate to use this word because it's so misunderstood, but are way more woke than many Democratic voters or the coalition that you're describing, especially Black voters. And there's been some speculation that it's these young white progressives that have driven the Biden administration to take some positions or advocate for some policies that have failed utterly or have not garnered the votes necessary. It's moved Biden away from a centrist kind of coalition building presidency to appease his left flank. Do you think that's kind of the Achilles heel of the Democratic Party right now? Is they're too beholden to those young, white, angry, so-called woke voices?
Yeah, I think it's a real weakness, and it's not just the party establishment. It is the array of outside activist organizations. It's the array. It's philanthropy. So you're going to have a really disproportionate number in a lot of these elite institutions of people coming out of Harvard, Yale, Brown, Dartmouth, Stanford, and they're well to the left of the median Democrat, and they're far more online than the median Democrat. So not only are they more left, the fact that they're more online means that they're more a part of the churn of the conversation.
Yeah,
and
these are the blue check Twitter people.
Right, exactly. And one of the most insightful things about the 2020 election was actually written in 2019 by Nate Silver. And he came out with this big study of the difference between online Democrats and offline Democrats. In other words, the Democrats who don't spend much time on social media versus those who do. And what he found is that 1/3 of the Democratic Party is online. 2/3 of the Democratic Party is offline. The offline Democrats tend to be far more diverse and far more moderate. The online Democrats tend to be far wider and far more progressive. And so the people who are talking the most end up having disproportionate influence, at least until the voting starts. And the interesting thing there was in 2020, who was the candidate that sailed to the nomination? It was the most offline of the candidates, Joe Biden.
Right.
And
he got there because Clyburn and other black leaders really mobilized the vote for him in places like South Carolina among African-American voters.
Yeah. I mean, once Clyburn jumped in and once Biden won South Carolina, it was the biggest rout of a Democratic primary I've seen since the Clinton years, right? So, well, gosh, I'd have to maybe even go back further than that, because Clinton and both Clinton and Obama, Hillary certainly, they all had nail-biting primaries. Biden had a nail-biting primary for about 2 minutes, and then it was just a rout. And so, now the interesting thing is that narrative about the Biden administration, I think, is only partially correct. So if you look at some of the actual legislation that has come through the Biden administration, it's not so radical. So, the infrastructure bill, if you look at the gun control compromise, if you're going to look at likely Electoral Count Act reform, or at least a hope Electoral Count Act reform, any number, semiconductor, like chip manufacturing, all of these things that are coming through are pretty moderate. But where he's had some of his most spectacular failures is when he sort of doubled down behind the much more the further left constituency, whereas a couple of examples, when he supported the Equality Act, but included within the Equality Act, RFRA repeal to the extent, Religious Freedom Restoration Act appeal to the extent that it touched on the Equality Act. Well, that's an own goal. Like that, why are you putting that in this bill that could have some support otherwise? Or some of the more extreme abortion bills that have come through. And a lot of those have failed because of Joe Manchin or others. But the record there is mixed. The stuff he's gotten through has tended to be more moderate, where he's had some very public failures has been much more to the left.
Okay, so if you have this God gap widening in the Democratic coalition, and it's especially discernible along the lines of race, is there something similar going on in the Republican Party? Not necessarily a God gap, but I don't know if it's a crazy gap or just a Trump gap. There's some other kind of gap. So you have the extreme left flank of the Democratic Party, white progressive secularists, who are using rhetoric and ideas and advocating for policies that the general Democratic voter isn't on board with, because they're still religious and they're still relatively moderate. And then on the right, you have the MAGA extremists, the Trump cult, that is, double down on crazy at this point, and it's alienating more moderate Republicans from that coalition. So where do all of us who are somewhere in that middle go when neither party's voice and platform and talking heads really represents us? In a two-party system, we all feel homeless now.
Well, you raise a great question, Skye. And the first thing that I would say is, yes, you're absolutely right. The Republicans have their own version of this problem. And that's what got Joe Biden elected, right? So the Republicans are repelling a certain class of voters, educated white voters, often but not always living in the suburbs. So if you want to see where Joe Biden lost, where Joe Biden won and Donald Trump lost in 2020, it was not the big urban vote.
Right.
In many of these big cities, Trump actually did maybe a little better than he'd done before, a little bit. Where he lost was he did a lot worse in the suburbs. And so the Republicans are repelling a certain class of voters, just as the Democrats are starting to repel a certain class of voters. And we're in this really weird situation, Skye, where the best asset of each party is the other party. So the other party is the one that is driving their recruitment, because they're making the culture of their party so intolerable for a certain part of their traditional coalition.
Yeah.
And so then what ends up happening, and this is something that we've talked about, that I've written a ton about, is you end up with these polarizing wings, these highly secular progressives on the Democratic left and the extremely motivated reactionary populist Republicans, right-wingers on the Republican right. And then you have this big, what's called the exhausted majority.
Mm-hmm.
And this is part of people on the right, on the middle, on the left, who are sick of it all. They are sick of it all, and they don't. And the problem with motivating them, Sky, and giving them an alternative is exactly what I just said. They're on the right, they're on the left, and they're in the middle. They're, other than their sort of shared revulsion at what's happening in American politics, they don't have a lot else in common. And that's a tough coalition to forge together.
So if you were supreme dictator of the American system and you could wave a magic wand and change our electoral politics in some way, what structural or policy changes could you envision that might create a saner political system that rewards candidates who appeal to that exhausted middle? Is it as simple as we need ranked choice voting and we need to change the gerrymandering districting rules? Is it do we need stronger parties? I've talked to John Ward. He said, he's argued that the parties have gotten so weak that now individual personalities are overtaking our politics rather than the party system that used to keep those things in check. What would you do to avoid the wings having all the power here?
Well, there's a couple of, there's a few things I would do, but also at some point voters have to step up. Like at some point,
come on, David, you're expecting
at some
too much.
Point, I'm sorry. So a few things. One, I'm a big believer. John's right. My colleague Jonah Goldberg has been talking about this forever. We need stronger parties.
And what's preventing that? What's preventing that?
People are attached to the primary system. I mean, imagine if a party said tomorrow, we're going to dramatically curtail the primary system. 50% of our delegates are going to be selected by party leaders. 50% are going to be selected by voter. A lot of the rank and file would get really, really upset. They've grown up there. The number of there's only a small minority of Americans who can remember a time when primaries didn't decide. So that's kind of one of those things that's like, it'd be nice if we could have unicorns, so stronger parties. But, we have to realize that both the Democratic and Republican systems have failed even in their distinctive ways. So I would much more in favor of the way the Democrats allocate primary delegates, which is proportional,
right,
versus winner take all. Under a proportional system, I'm not sure that Donald Trump ultimately would have become the nominee in 2016. But
we've talked about this before, and the idiosyncrasies of the Republican system that worked in his favor. That doesn't seem like an insurmountable change. We're not talking about getting rid of primaries. We're talking about proportional allocation of delegates. That seems tolerable for most people.
That's attainable. I think ranked choice voting, at least on an experimental basis, is attainable. The one that is, I think, that is moving into the realm of almost impossible, but still somewhat attainable. We have to be able to do something about gerrymandering. As of right now, roughly about 15% of the electorate selects over 80% of our legislature. And
which is bonkers.
It's bonkers. And it's creating instability because what happens is for the vast majority of our representatives, the only threat to their career, their reasonable threat to their career, is coming from their more extreme flank.
Right.
That's where if you're a rational politician, let's just say let's just take morality out of it. And you're saying, my goal is to attain and retain power. Well, you're constantly going to be motivated to tack to your right if you're a Republican or to your left if you're a Democrat, constantly. And that leaves a shrinking pool of hapless folks in some of these swing districts who are totally at the mercy of the extremes of their parties, even though they're sitting there saying, the more extreme you are, the more likely I am to lose.
This is a point that I can't say I've studied it extensively, but to the degree I've read up on it, I find perplexing because at least since the Reagan era, one of the strongest rhetorical devices that conservatives have had is this belief in free market economics. This emphasis on let the invisible hand of the market determine the winners and losers. The government shouldn't be stepping in and favoring certain businesses or industries or whatever. And the market has a wisdom of its own that will self-correct. Progressives and Democrats, they'll say that's bogus and we need better regulation. But they've made that argument for 40, 50 years. But they won't apply it to politics. They won't take that same logic and say, hey, we want a free market of political expression so that what the people believe to be the best candidate wins the office. Instead, they gerrymander their districts and create essentially picking their voters rather than the voters picking the candidates to guarantee that one party stays in power, whether it's in that district or state or in the congressional district. And it's anti-free market. It's anti-democratic. But the Republicans are doing that just as much as the Democrats. And where do their values around the invisible hand of the market and democracy and freedom come into play in this area?
Well, I think the answer is this is politics, Guy. It's not for the market. No, I think
it's a different kind of market, but it's still a market.
Right. Well, I think the bottom line is you have something of and maybe this is not the perfect analogy or the perfect comparison, but like the prisoner's dilemma. You go first.
Right.
If you're against gerrymandering, you go first. Well, wait, if I go first and I eliminate gerrymandering in my state, then I'm going to be weaker than you are. You're going to be laughing at my gullibility. And so, and the other thing is, and this is something that we really need to put a pin on when we're talking about gerrymandering, is gerrymandering makes a bad situation worse. And the bad situation, which I'm talking about, is the big sort. So the fact of the matter is Americans are voluntarily living and working with people who are like-minded much more than in years past. And so even if you got rid of gerrymandering, our sorting in this country would create disproportionate districting as it is. It would be very difficult to sort of take a 60, it's getting to the point, let me put it this way, Sky, it's getting to the point with people clustering together so much that if you have a 60-40 state, for you to have a 60-40 congressional delegation, you'd have to gerrymander. In other words, you'd have to take every district and reach it into an urban area and carve out part of the urban area. And sort of like a pizza pie, right? You'd have to carve the urban area into different districts to adjust, to match the balance of where the state population is. And so the big sort has become so extreme that it magnifies the gerrymandering problem a great deal.
That's true. Fair enough. Okay, last question before we move on to another topic. In your piece about the God gap on the Democratic, within the Democratic Party, you talk about the danger of one party becoming too identified as the faith party.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's now the Republican Party. It's kind of been that way for a few decades, but it's increasingly now, as we see more African Americans, Latinos of faith gravitating away from the Democratic Party and toward the Republican Party. And as Democratic rhetoric is becoming less and less religious, I still remember, I think it was 2006, when then Senator Obama gave a really amazing speech about the role of religion in American public life and American politics. I recommend people go back and listen to it. I would imagine he'd be just absolutely blasted if he gave that kind of speech today in the Democratic Party, because it was so affirming and magnanimous towards the role of religion in public life. But as the Democratic Party becomes less and less receptive to that kind of messaging, and the Republican Party unilaterally is now identified as the party for religious people, you see some dangers in that.
Oh, such
explain
dangers.
Why that's a problem.
Well, first, if you're listening to this and you're a Democrat, it's very dangerous for your party, because look, America is a very religious country relative to other advanced democracies in the world. There has been a rise in the nuns and ONESs and a decrease in church attendance, but it's still really religious. And the more your activist base of your party becomes secular, the more you're going to actually alienate yourself from a majority of the country in some fundamental ways. So that's a danger for the Democrats, but it's also a danger for America writ large. And that is, if you're going to talk about the sources of civil strife in a country, well, identity, ethnicity certainly is one source of civil strife that we've seen around the world. But here's another one: religious strife, where you have a stark religious binary where one party is the religion of a party of one religion and another party is the party of a different religion. I mean, you think Hindu Muslim in India, you think
Mm-hmm.
Catholic Protestant in Northern Ireland, Sunni Shia in Iraq. I mean, you just go down the line. So if you have a party that is much more secular and a party that's much more religious, that's a formula for strife in the same way that a party that's super white versus a party that's super diverse is a formula for strife. And then the last thing is, and this is one that I think people really need to understand, is that it's dangerous for religion as well. It's dangerous for Christianity, because what begins to happen is that if you have the religion party, then their platform becomes seen as the religion platform or the Christian platform. And yet a host of issues in the United States of America don't have a clear sort of Christian position for them. What's the Christian level of immigration? What's the Christian position on Puerto Rican statehood? What's the Christian position on fracking? All of these things are super debatable. But if you get it to where there's one party that's advancing X, and that's the Christian party, then it's easy to say, well, supporting the platform of party X is tantamount to sort of like, it's like supporting your creeds.
Right.
It's part of your religious identity. And my goodness, that's dangerous for religion. It's dangerous.
I've told this story before, but many years ago, I was preaching a sermon that was mostly on identity. And after the message, at the time my kids were young, but this older gentleman came up to me. His kids were probably high school, college age. And he was just disturbed by my message. And to his credit, he was coming up to me to talk and clarify things. A lot of times people just go home and write you a nasty email or something, but he wanted to come up and talk to me about it. And he genuinely couldn't quite grasp what my message what the intent was, which meant I utterly failed as a communicator. So finally, back and forth as we were talking at the front of the church there, I said to him, listen, here's what it's about. At the end of the day, is it more important to you that your children grow up and follow Jesus, or is it more important that they grow up and vote Republican? And in all sincerity, he said to me, what's the difference?
Yeah.
He could not, in his imagination, that those two things being separate were an impossibility. And I think that's the danger you're talking about.
Yes.
And when we conflate the two, which is just everywhere in the church at least in the white evangelical church these days, when we conflate the two, it does an enormous amount of damage to the faith. And it makes it that much harder to do the mission of the gospel, because people think if I'm going to follow Jesus, I need to convert to conservative Republican politics. Yeah.
And one thing that I found is that there is an a remaining unwillingness on the part of an awful lot of white evangelicals to grapple with the reality that Black Protestants, that non-white evangelicals tend to have very different political, even though there is a migration because of the outlier secular identity of a lot of white progressive, even though there's this migration that you're beginning to see, the bulk of non-white Christians are still are Democrats. And what you don't see is any real effort to grapple with that theologically. In other words, to say,
right,
is there an argument theologically for why they would choose this versus, well, that's just an artifact of history. And once they break out of that history, then they'll come be with us because we're theologically correct. The sort of like the peak of that was that ridiculous statement from Al Mohler where he said, I can only, Christians, it's hard for me to see any reason for a Christian to vote anything but Republican for the foreseeable future, except if you're black. Except if you're black. Oh, really? Okay, now why is that?
And the irony, we've brought this up before, and this gets back to Stephen Carter's quote, which I read earlier. When you look at the statistics, the Christians in America who read the Bible the most, who are most orthodox in their theology, who are the most devoted to the scriptures, who are the most devoted to prayer, are African-American Christians. And they overwhelmingly vote for the Democratic Party. I'm not saying that they have their, that they're, we should, model exactly what they're doing politically
Right.
versus what the whites are. But you at least have to wrestle with the fact that these are the most biblically literate and Orthodox Christians in America, and they don't vote like most white evangelicals. That should at least cause some cognitive dissonance that makes you slow down and reconsider things. But we don't do that.
That's exactly my point. If faithful Bible-believing Christians are coming to different political conclusions from you, then it would be, I think, arrogant to say, well, they're Christians, but they're just they're all those folks, they're just completely off. I've got it right on theology and politics. And again, I'm with you, Sky. I'm not saying, well, Black Democrats have it all figured out theologically, and you need to be a member of the Democratic Party. I'm a member of neither party, but the reality that faithful Christians come to completely different political conclusions in this two-party system should give us a huge dose of humility in sort of any sort of assertion that says the Christian position is to be a Republican or to be a Democrat.
Yeah. And to my Black sisters and brothers who are part of that tradition of the church, important for them to be engaging relationally with people who, from the white evangelical tradition, may be more conservative in their politics, to engage them and ask, how did they come to those conclusions? And be in dialogue with one another. Let's move on to another topic. Related, but another topic. One of my favorite things to keep track of is who's mad at David French now and for what? It could be like an online game that we could create. Maybe the Dispatch can create something like that. You could create a trivia contest. So you wrote a piece recently, again, in the realm of politics, titled, "There is no remaining Christian case for Trump." And this is built on a lot of what we've been learning from the January 6th committee, which has had numerous televised hearings and lots of witnesses come through, adding a lot of detail and texture to what was going on, not just on January 6th, but the whole post-election months and all the work that was being done by Trump and his clown car of goons that were trying to overturn this election. I didn't really think there was much of a Christian case for Trump before these hearings came out. What's changed that makes you think, okay, now there's really no case from a Christian point of view for him?
Yeah, that's a super fair question, because I wasn't convinced by the Christian case for Trump all the way back in 2015, 2016. Right. But the way there's a couple of things that I think are now different. Okay, so we've now had 6 years of Trump front and center in American life. Actually, more than 6 years, because it was, I believe, June of 2015 that he came down the escalator. So 7 years, Sky. We've been dealing with this for 7 years of Trump front and center. And one thing that, and the main point of the piece was, one thing that's become very clear to me is that Trump has influenced the church more than the church has influenced Trump. And I use the term discipling, that Trump discipled the church more than the church discipled Trump. And in addition to some of the more basic stuff, like, wait a minute, all of the arguments you gave me in 2016 and 2020 about binary choice, it's either Trump or Hillary, or it's either Trump or Biden, they're not operative anymore. I mean, there's other options. So what you're saying is Trump is...
Yeah, but that really wasn't operative in 2015 either in the primaries. There were 16 choices other than Trump.
Yeah. Yeah. But again, he won with the smallest plurality of any Republican in the primary era.
And that gets back to the ridiculous ways that the Republican primaries allocate. We've been through that.
Yeah, exactly. So let's just put aside the very practical thing of, you're actually going to tell me that Donald Trump is, from a Christian perspective, a preferable candidate to any list of half a dozen other Republicans who would appoint the same judges, et cetera. But let's look at the larger picture of the influence. And there are reasons. I began the piece with some examples of Ted Cruz, for example, outspoken evangelical, speaking of the Turning Point Conference, where he says, my pronouns are kiss my ass.
Not the kind of rhetoric I want coming from my national leaders.
And this is somebody who's positioned himself as a Christian political leader.
So certainly not from a Christian leader.
Josh Hawley, who again, this is a guy who's written against the Pelagian heresy and Christianity Today, right? He refuses to apologize for his role in the election contest, which was utterly fraudulent, just utterly fraudulent. Fist bumping the crowd. I mean, fist pumping the crowd.
Can we pause on that for a second? It's one thing for Josh Hawley to not apologize, which, the moral bankruptcy of that is alone is bad. But what I understood him to be saying when I saw that clip was, it's his way of saying, I still believe that the 2020 election was stolen. Is that right? I mean, it'd be one thing to say, I'm not going to apologize for what I did on January 6th because I believe it was the right thing at the time. However, as subsequent evidence has come out, I no longer believe the election was stolen. Like, he could have done that.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of Republican candidates right now who are all saying they think 2020 was stolen still.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's just factually untrue.
Oh, it's just a lie. It's just a lie. And to remain now, if he's going to parse it in a lawyerly way, he might say, I'm proud of the fact that I challenged the Pennsylvania results. Like that's about as sort of narrow and lawyerly, which is again absurd. Absurd. There was and I just pulled out Cruz and Hawley and Matt Gaetz, who, by the way, calls himself a Southern Baptist, who went on a truly awful tirade at the same conference, and they were I pulled them out because they were literally examples of people, of either Christian leaders or people who hold themselves out as Christian leaders from like the last 24 hours before I wrote my piece. But they were symbolic of what we've seen around the country, which is the movement of Christians in their political lives to be more like Trump. Mm-hmm. And anyone who tells me that this isn't happening is just gaslighting, because we all see it and experience it every day. I mean, how many of us know people who no longer either are often, sometimes even in relationship with members of their own family or longtime friends because of the aggression, or at least have learned that I'm not going to even speak about a lot of important issues around family members and longtime friends because of this nonstop aggression. And it's everywhere. It is everywhere. And it's breaking apart families. It's breaking apart relationships. It's breaking apart friendships. And look, I'm not saying politics was perfect before Trump came down the escalator. There were a lot of problems with it. There were more problems than I even saw, to be honest. But it was not like it is now. It was not like it is now.
I totally, obviously agree. Let me ask you this, though. At least on the political front, when I look at a Gaetz or a Hawley or Cruz, typically what I've observed in politics is people who have ambitions in the political realm try to mimic the successful politicians that have preceded them. Ronald Reagan transformed a generation of politicians into the Reagan-esque model. Bill Clinton figured out a new way to be a Democrat in the 1990s, created a whole new school of Democratic, third way. Even compassionate conservatism with George W. Bush in the early 2000s, right? That he had a following. The thing I don't get about what's happening right now is you see all these conservative politicians who are becoming angry, combative, don't give an inch, never apologize, demonize, very Trumpian in their tone. The problem is Trump failed over and over and over again. He lost the Senate for the Republican Party. He lost the House of Representatives. He lost re-election in 2020. He was impeached twice. He may well be indicted now he is a loser. I don't understand why so many Republican politicians are mimicking somebody who has proven to be an utter failure by almost any measure in the political realm.
Well, there's two reasons for it, and they're related. One reason is the big lie about the election is one of the most successful lies that I have ever seen in my life, as far as just the ability to persuade tens of millions of people of something that's just fundamentally false. So, there was a reason why after 1980, no one in the Democratic Party was saying, you know what, we need more Jimmy Carter.
Right.
There was a reason why in 92, people were not saying, you know what we need to do? Run back George H.W. Bush. The best case scenario was thank you for your service to your country. You're a good man. Now we have to do something different. The more normal case was go away, you loser. And which was unfortunate because there, that was unfortunate for many reasons. But with Trump, he so successfully persuaded people that he was the winner that all of those normal rules of a one-term president don't apply. And then the other thing is, he didn't just persuade your average everyday person that he was actually a winner. He's persuaded a cohort of the most toxic, angry, vicious people in the whole United States that he was the winner. And so if you're a politician, you're a public official, and you're going to go against that Trumpian assertion that he's the winner, it's not like you're going to face a few polite but firm tweets and some pointed op-eds. You might face armed protesters outside your house. You might face a hurricane of death threats. And so the untold story, or the not sufficiently told story of conservative politics in this era, is the extent to which people did what they've done out of raw fear, out of just raw fear for their families, for their lives, for their livelihoods. And so it's not just that Trump persuaded a bunch of people of the lie, it's also who he persuaded that matters a lot.
Yeah, I get that. And I can understand why there are a lot of, these stories come out all the time. I've heard some of them on your podcast where some of you or some of your colleagues have reported talking to Republican office holders in Washington, especially, who off the record will admit all kinds of horrific things about Donald Trump, but they won't say those things publicly because they are worried about violence. They're worried about safety. They're worried about, the MAGA mob coming after them. And so I can partly understand why there are significant Republican leaders who are just keeping their mouth shut. They're just not engaging. But that doesn't quite explain Matt Gaetz, Josh Hawley, and Cruz, right? These are folks who it's their ambition that's driving them to behave the way they're behaving because they think they can be Donald Trump 2.0. They think they can ride the tiger and win re-election or even the White House by behaving like Trump. And that's the part that I find so perplexing. Like, it's not fear that's driving them to be a cheerleader for Trump. It's ambition. But the fact they think they're going to win using a losing, and they know he didn't win the election in 2020.
Yeah.
They're not dumb. They know he lost it. So that's the part I find I have to believe there's one part of them that really savors this. Like they enjoy the ugliness that they're allowed to engage in now and have been given permission to do, which makes me question their character even more.
A lot of cruel people like cruelty. I mean, if you actually hate another human being, cruelty is, if you're actually hating another human being, cruelty is all upside, because by inflicting cruelty on another person, even if they have the thickest skin imaginable, you're often at the very least inconveniencing them, security, etc. At the most, you're often hurting them, harming them, damaging them as people. And so there's a lot of, if you're just a malicious, there's a lot of upside to cruelty. And then if you can tie cruelty to ambition, all the better. So you're going to advance yourself at the same time you inflict pain on people you hate. And if you have zero sort of ethical frame, it's all upside for you. And until your cruelty and ambition are run so rampant that you cross the boundaries of criminal law often. But that's what we're seeing is this combination of cruelty and ambition. And what drives a lot of this is the same. So here's the game. And this is why they're not irrational to be like this. They know that cruelty is the coin of the realm for the hardcore Trumpist base. They know the hardcore Trumpist base in many jurisdictions in the United States controls the primary. They know if they win the primary, then they get to make the binary choice argument, right?
Right.
And once you make the binary choice argument, a whole bunch of Republicans who might be put off by the cruelty, but are just never going to vote Democrat, are going to come home. And you're going to win in spite of exhibiting values that a big part of your coalition doesn't like. And so that's one reason why I wrote the piece that I wrote, is I said that the binary choice lesser evil argument had terrible real world consequences. And we're seeing those play out right now in the fundamental way that Trump has changed sort of the Republican coalition.
So explain then some of the criticism or pushback you've gotten to that piece. What are they saying you got wrong in your analysis?
Well, one of the things that they're going to say that they've said that I got wrong is just that what Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley or any of these others are doing is wrong. That they're going to defend a Cruz, they're going to defend a Hawley, and they're basically going to say, look, I mean, Jesus flipped over tables.
Oh, I hate that argument. That always comes up.
Yep, we said the Pharisees had the poison of asps on their lips, their whitewashed tombs. The winsome wars come flaring back again. That, the left is just so bad that this aggression. Now, the interesting thing is, some people even go so far as to say this aggression is a form of kindness because it's bracing truth telling, right? It's very bracing truth.
Right.
And so you've got some people who, what's this lesser evil stuff you're talking about, David? This isn't evil at all. And this gets to the sort of this kind of spiritual degradation that I talk about in the piece, is because we don't like to be people who are like, yay, I'm team lesser evil.
Right.
We have a big pressure to sort of say, oh, no, it's not lesser evil. It's not evil at all. Actually, this is good because of desperate times call for desperate times call for desperate measures. The other argument is just one that sort of says, David, you're just wrong about what Trump is doing to the to the Christian community. You're wrong that he has had this kind of influence. That's just all a mainstream media lie. And you're just wrong about the effect that so if you're wrong about the effect on the church, you're wrong about the effect on the country.
So yeah, people are saying that you're just wrong, that Trump hasn't had the negative effect on Christians that you're observing.
Yeah. And you're buying into a mainstream media narrative. Yeah.
Is part of the dynamic here that, as you put it, we're 7 years into this Trump phenomenon. And those who got on board, for them to at this point say, forget anything negative about Trump, but if they were simply to say, we're not going to use cruelty anymore, we're not going to profit from lies and further the big lie, we're not going to demonize people. If they stop doing those things, that's an implicit confession that what we have been part of for the last 7 years was wrong, and it was ungodly, and it was unethical. And there's such a reluctance to admit maybe I was wrong that they just double, triple, quadruple down on what they've been doing and come up with whatever rationalization they can, whether it's Jesus flipped tables or no, it's not really having that. Is that what's going on? It's psychological. It's that cognitive dissonance thing again. We have to resolve it. So no, there's nothing inconsistent with the way of Jesus here. And to show you, we're just going to keep right at it.
I do think that's part of it, but also one thing that I think is interesting is we're just continually seeing the power of leadership, both in a toxic way and the power of good leadership, although good leadership has been sort of thin on the ground these last few years. But leaders have real cultural power, and toxic leaders have real cultural power. And so what we've seen is that in many ways, Trump has not just changed people to be more cruel and angrier, but he's also changed them in a way that's particularly damaging for Christianity, and that is this scorning of repentance and apologies.
Right.
Because we are a people who should be a people of a people of repentance. I mean, not just sort of the big repentance, I'm a sinner, save me, Lord, but also an understanding that in the process of sanctification, we're still going to sin a lot. We're going to wake up and we're going to sin. We're going to wake up the next day and we're going to sin. And so repentance is an ongoing process. And that sort of basic background level of humility is an indispensable necessity for the Christian walk. And I can think of few kind of cultural ideas more toxic than the idea that an apology is a sign of weakness, that any sort of concession to your enemies is a sign of cowardice. And so there's a very specific way that Trump has impacted the culture of the church when it comes to politics, in a way that's beyond anything like, I don't think Trump has made people accept adultery more in like their own relationships, right? Or has made people support porn more just because Trump appeared in a Playboy video. I think it's what has happened is that Trump has adjusted the culture in an even more insidious way, if possible, that is essentially saying what we must do and who we must be as a people is to become more pugilistic and less repentant.
Just a week ago, I did a sermon, and about this idea of our inability to admit when we're wrong. And part of the research I did for it was studying
Oops, I
the
lost
way
you.
Christians and churches responded to the invention of the lightning rod in the 18th century with Benjamin Franklin. And there were a lot of churches that were both in Europe and in the colonies, that were really opposed to lightning rods because they believed that lightning was the wrath of God against sinners.
Mhm.
And to put a lightning rod was to interfere with God's will and all this sort of stuff. And when it was later pointed out to them, well, if lightning is God's wrath against sinners, why is it that it's mostly churches that are getting struck by lightning and burning down rather than brothels and bars? And we know it's because church steeples were the tallest structures in the town. They were attracting the lightning. Well, then they came up with another excuse, which is, well, sometimes God judges the world passively by allowing evil spirits to cause mischief. And lightning is actually caused by demons. And sometimes those demons come after the church. So this is all their justification for why.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't put a lightning rod on it because it's, again, interfering with God's judgment. So then they concocted this idea that the real way to combat thunder demons is by ringing church bells when storms are approaching. And the data is fascinating. In the 30 years following the invention of the lightning rod, hundreds and hundreds of people were electrocuted in churches because they would send people up into the bell towers as thunderstorms were approaching to keep the demons away from. But it's a case where the refusal to admit that maybe I don't understand how lightning works led to even more catastrophic decisions to prove how right I am. And I wonder if that's sort of what's going on with the Republican Party and some Christians in the Republican side of the aisle, where they're saying, I so refuse to admit that maybe I was wrong about Trump, that we're going to now double and triple down on these ideas.
Yeah.
And it's just going to be worse and worse. But is that ultimately the hope, that eventually things get so bad for the Republican Party that Christians are like, they wake up from this fever dream and shake it off and go, oh, this is, or are they just on an inevitable road to destruction at this point and there's nothing we can do?
Well, that's an interesting big question, because this is where our conversation comes full circle back to the beginning. Because if you had a very healthy Democratic Party, that would be in many ways the
Right.
story of the next 4 to 6 to 8 years of a healthy party accumulating sort of all of the refugees of the unhealthy party, and the unhealthy party sort of burning itself to death on its own pride, right? But when you have one party that has its own very deep divisions,
Yes.
and so the divisions are so deep that they're sending some people into the arms of another unhealthy party, then you begin to see how we could be in a position where you have two unhealthy, and this goes back to the thing that I said, where each party now in some ways legitimately looks to the other party as its greatest asset.
Right.
And so how good do I have to be if I can point to the other guys and say they're worse, right? And now I think that the Republican Party is I like the analogy that Jonathan Rauch uses. He's often asked he decries and condemns the illiberalism on the left and the illiberalism on the right. And everyone wants to know which one's worse, because that's what everybody wants to know. And I love the way he puts it. He says, one is a heart attack and the other is cancer. And he said,
yeah.
So which one's worse? He says the right is more of the heart attack because it is more likely to cause sudden death to the body politic, like January 6th. He said that's the illiberals and radicals on the right. He says the illiberals and radicals on the left are more like cancer because they are disproportionately concentrated in a lot of very powerful cultural institutions where they're sort of eating away at American classical liberalism from within. And so he's like, which one's worse? I'm going to put it back to you, the heart attack or the cancer. And I think that's a brilliant analogy. And so that again brings us back to this exhausted majority concept, where the majority of Americans don't want the heart attack, nor do they want the cancer, but they haven't figured out a way to exert their will yet.
So because we don't have a parliamentary system, And we've never really successfully had multiple parties. It's always been a binary choice of some form or another. Is this a case where we just have to wait this out and hopefully there's some structural changes and we see one or both of these parties reinvent themselves, renew themselves? Or can you envision any scenario in which a new party emerges that can be a receptacle for all those exhausted people in the middle?
So I am a skeptic of third party efforts.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I do remember in the 1992 election season when Ross Perot actually led the polls. He led, and then he had his own issues, right? He accused the GOP of conspiring to undermine his daughter's wedding. True story. That's what he used as an excuse to drop out of the race. Then he drops back into the race, and he still gets almost 20% of the vote. I mean, it was a remarkable.
And he had a rather odd vice presidential choice.
An American hero who was not ready at that stage in his life to be a vice presidential choice.
Which led to one of the best Saturday Night Live skits ever of a vice presidential debate.
Yeah. And think about that. That was Bush, H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a viable third party challenger. What if you run back Donald Trump and Joe Biden? There's going to be an enormous amount of discontent with that. Just enormous. So if there was ever a cycle where you could have somebody come in with resources, with a compelling personal story, and offer a third party who's 30 years younger than the contenders, which would still put him in his 50s, for at least compared to Biden, then there's actually a chance. But it'd have to be the right person and have to be very well resourced. But that's the kind of, catastrophic to the parties kind of occurrence that would cause a real rethink, is if you've sort of had the person come truly from the outside. Now, I don't think that's likely, but I think it's more possible than it's been in a long time.
Okay. I may have asked you this before, but last question as we wrap along those lines. What's the likelihood of Donald Trump and Joe Biden first actually running again, throwing their hat into the ring, and actually being their party's nominees?
That's a great question. Ironically enough, the Democrats, I believe, are less likely to renominate Joe Biden than the Republicans are to renominate Donald Trump. Uh-huh. And Joe Biden beat Donald Trump.
Right.
Right now, all of the polling indicates that Joe Biden has less of a hold on the Democratic Party than Donald Trump has on the Republican Party. That is a universal polling conclusion. And just to give you as a concrete example, there was a New Hampshire Democratic Party primary poll that had Pete Buttigieg number 1 in New Hampshire. Pete Buttigieg, Biden number 2, and guess where Kamala Harris was? 7th.
Yeah.
7th. And so I think it's actually less likely that the Democrats renominate Joe Biden than it is that the Republicans renominate Donald Trump. Now, watch this happen. Watch the Democrats renominate Joe Biden and the Republicans reject Donald Trump. I mean, this is years out prognostication. But as of right now, the data is very clear that a Biden-Trump rematch is not super likely, and it's not super likely because of the Democrats, not because of the Republicans.
Yeah, I just wonder if, looking at some of those same polls that you're mentioning, does Biden, after the midterms, somehow, he becomes a lame duck the moment he says it, but does he somehow indicate, I'm not going to run? Because he knows he wouldn't get nominated again, and his age is a factor. And is there any scenario in which Trump doesn't run again? I think everyone in the country is just eager for some new voices and some new candidates, but we'll see. It's going to be an interesting cycle coming up.
And here's the crazy thing. The more likely it looks that Trump could be indicted, in many ways means the more likely he runs.
That's right.
because
I wonder if that's part of the reason the Justice Department has been so slow in unveiling any possible investigation or indictment, because it basically would force him to run, because that's his only defense, is they're coming after me politically because they don't want me to be president again.
And it, ironically enough, it may be one of the reasons why he announces as early as some people have reported as September, before the midterms, which is wild, because he wants to be in the position of being the Republican frontrunner for president. And who's going to indict the Republican frontrunner for president? Who's got the guts to do that? And what a mess.
What a mess. A great point to end on. David, thank you for your writing, for your insights, for your perspective. Appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Sky. It's always a pleasure.
French Friday is a production of The Holy Post, featuring David French and me, Sky Jethani. Production by Carla Haskins. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This podcast is made possible by the support of Holy Post listeners like you. To find out how you can become a supporter of the Holy Post and to engage more common good Christian content, visit holypost.com.